welcome everyone to the third episode of the ABT Time podcast with my ABT Time official mug that we're going to get some more made eventually for everybody involved with this production. And we have some wonderful news to start with today, which is we have our official correspondent from Australia, our official Australian correspondent, Jen Martin, who was the guest on the first round and did such a great job. We've invited her to come back in the permanent position as part of the crew. Welcome, Jen. What time is it down there?
What an honor, Randy. It is 8 a.m. on Thursday morning. So good morning from the future, from Australia. I've got my morning cup of tea. And what a delight to get to be your Aussie correspondent. I feel like I should just, put that on my CV right now.
It would be good for next to nothing at the moment, but let's hope that someday it amounts to something and somebody's impressed with it. Let's see here. Should I start with sharing some slides? Can you see that, Jen?
I can see it. Okay,
for our YouTube viewers. And by the way, remind me if I get going on visuals and the listeners, because this is mostly going out, posted everywhere as a podcast. So people are hopefully listening to it when they're driving somewhere. And let's hope that we can entertain and engage them. The core of what this whole podcast is about, a number of people have asked me, so what's the podcast about? It's the ABT. Yeah, typical.
Surely they were a bit less polite, Randy. Didn't they say, what the hell are you doing now?
And even worse.
I'm going to be polite.
The core purpose of this thing, the overarching narrative, is the ABT template. So over and over again, we'll be relating everything. That's the criteria. It's all got to relate to that. You're not going to hear about what I went shopping for at Whole Foods yesterday or anything of that sort. But if you do, it's got something to do with narrative in the ABT template. And it's mostly meant to be a place to kind of freely talk about the ABT framework, why it's so incredibly important, applying it to different things. And then we're going to go through, so I got a bunch of stories lined up. As a matter of fact, for starters, I put together a list 2 weeks ago of 25 topics, and I still haven't even looked at that list yet. I'm sure every week there's so much stuff piling up. Actually, here's one fun little thing right now. This is kind of trivial, but this is just along the lines of the ABT is everywhere. And Mike, let's see here. Mike Strauss, who's part of our group, sent me this thing from AARP, and this is their newsletter, and it's just automatic ABT structure. It's tell your Congress lower prescription prices. And the text here says, prescription drugs do amazing things. They prevent heart attacks. They can attack cancer in its tracks. They give people with diabetes life-saving insulin. So all of the and stuff, all the wonderful things. And then literally the second paragraph begins with, but medications don't work if people can't afford them. And too many Americans are forced to choose between. And then the third paragraph, therefore, the good news is last week, President Biden, blah, blah, blah. Perfect ABT structure there. You see it everywhere. It's just like the old FedEx logo, as my buddy Aaron Huertas pointed out years ago. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You got any?
And Randy, meanwhile, you've shown us all that we should never expect an email reply from you, because you've got more than 8,500 unread emails sitting there. Okay. So it's a good message, good public service announcement.
What am I sharing here with the YouTube crowd? Exactly. Oh my God!
Exactly. You've just gone public.
All the offensive subject lines from my friends. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, back to Jen Martin, our official Australia correspondent for ABT Time podcast. You spotted any ABT structured things lately? Anything come to mind?
I think it's like I can't remember where it is in your stage of teaching the ABT, but the video that you have that kind of outlays your discovery of the ABT and talking about floccododos and I can't remember who it was who made the comment that once you've seen the arrow in the FedEx sign, that's how it is with ABT. And I show that video to anyone I introduce the ABT to. I'm like, you're going to have to sit through 12 minutes of bloody Randy talking, but it'll be worth it because he can explain it better than I can. But I feel like, once you've sort of got an eye in for it, you see it everywhere. And that email I sent you during the week from a communications expert proclaiming that but is a really dangerous word and we should avoid using but because it shuts off avenues of communication. And yet I'm thinking, no, but is the key to getting people interested in the world. If you don't use buts, how are you going to get them listening?
Yeah, no, that's gets right to the core of it. We ran into that years ago. I started working with the groundlings, and I did a series of workshops with a group called the Society for Hospital Leadership. And Jeremy Rowley is one of the groundlings cast members one of the first guys I met. He's part of the group now for those Progressive Insurance commercials with Flo, the Progressive Insurance lady. For those of you who know that, he's one of her main kind of co-stars in those. And great guy. And I took him to a few of these workshops with doctors, and I had him doing improv stuff in one room while I was doing narrative in the other room. And a bunch of people came over and said, Jeremy's over there telling us never use the word but in improv. And how does that square with you talking to here about and, but, and therefore? And the answer totally squares away, which is that both improv is mostly that open, it's the and stuff at the beginning. It's all this positivity and agreement, and you grow ideas up with that. But then ideas need to be shaped, and that's where the word but comes in. And if you're not doing both,
exactly.
You're not doing it. And it's not as simple. You hear some of these people always be positive. You can do that, but you're not really going to get far with making an impact in the long term. You've got to be tapping into narrative, which is the two ends of the spectrum, the positive. I mean, it's the yin and the yang. It's the the positive force, and then the shaping force.
And I think when it comes to researchers, where, the bulk of my experience with the ABT is teaching researchers how to use it. So yesterday I was running a workshop for a group of young statisticians, and they got it immediately and said, yep, this is a tool that'll help us explain what we're doing. And a couple of them commented, this is the key we've been looking for to help us explain this stuff. And when you're a researcher, it isn't all just positive, because the whole reason you're doing the research is that you've got a problem that you're trying to solve. So there has to be a but, or what's the point in doing the research in the first place?
It's exactly. And it's amazing the number of people have the same thing you just said, which is they say, we already knew this. We didn't know there was a tool that described it like this, but intuitively they've been doing it their whole life. I
think it's about giving permission, it's about giving permission to people to say, yes, this seems like a really simple tool, but it's actually a tool that works, and you can just adopt this simple tool and it will help. Because I think people kind of go, oh, come on, that's not really narrative. It's too basic. It's like, well, sometimes basic is exactly what you want.
Yeah. And we're getting there. I keep saying to people, we're basically building Mount ABT. It's a long, slow process, but brick by brick, stone by stone, we are building Mount ABT, and it'll continue to be built. The course is now booked through the end of the year. We're overbooked now.
Nice.
We've got a number of government agencies that have locked in. Right now, we started actually on yesterday. We started round 14 of the course with, we're splitting it. What we do nowadays more and more is like to split the course between two groups for diversity. And the stuff is all about diversity. It's about reaching that outer circle. And what you don't want is all 30 people from the same group, because then they fall into the end thing. They all understand each other. Oh, wow, that's a great narrative. Nobody can understand it. So we split them. And this one is 15 each from FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, their Flight Research Center in New Jersey. So they are interested in scaling up eventually. But for now, I try and start these groups now. Just pick 15 people that kind of your decision makers. Let's have them run through and see if they like it or not. And then the other half of this one's National Park Service. We've got Fisheries Group. We've got what else? Just a whole bunch of different organizations coming together throughout the rest of the year. And the National Park Service is kind of set for several more rounds of it, and on. Tons and tons of fun as we continue to grow it. Let's see what else I've got here for slides. Okay, here's first thing to get very, very excited about. So today's episode is going to be a little bit of rambling. It's going to be a bunch of blah, blah, blah. We're going to have some fun, a little few items in the news that will maybe stir some people. But there's that word, but the big news is going to be next week on this podcast. And we're going to do our first special episode, and we're going to start hyping this thing the next day or so. I'm titling it Fire Above and Below. It is going to be a special 90-minute episode. And this is going to be focusing on wildfire, the problems of wildfire. And we're bringing in two experts. First off is from the National Park Service, Christy Brigham, who is kind of the main science director, I think, for Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in kind of the center of California, right there in the middle of all the Sequoia forests and the areas that have had huge burn problems. And I think they're all getting nervous about this upcoming fire season. It's looking like it's going to be really bad. So she will be presenting the California perspective. That is for above and below. That's the Northern Hemisphere. And then the southern hemisphere perspective will come from Australia, in which my correspondent for science communication down there is my buddy Jen Martin here. And I contacted her last week and said, is there any long shot chance you might know somebody in the Melbourne area, given the problems you've had with wildfire, that might know one or two things about the fire issue down there? And her answer was,
how about my husband, Randy? So Ewan is a professor of wildlife ecology at Deakin University, which is one of our big universities here in Melbourne. And he's done a huge amount of work looking at the effects of bushfires. So Aussie translation here, we don't call them wildfires, we call them bushfires. Gotcha. On wildlife. And we had a very bad bushfire season in our summer of 2019-2020. So December 2019, January 2020. And he's been very involved in the kind of media representation of what that means for our wildlife. And of course, having that then immediately followed by COVID, and then for a lot of people who were affected by the bushfires, and also immediately followed by floods. When I say immediately, over a period of a year or so, it's been a pretty full-on time. So I'll drag him along, Randy. He'll be very keen to talk with you.
What was the horrible incident with the bay there that everybody was evacuated to, and they were surrounded by fire? We saw that in the news here quite a bit. Where was that?
So that was in East Gippsland, which is in Victoria, so the same state that I'm in, but east of where I am. So parts of Gippsland, anywhere from sort of 3 to 5 hours drive east of where I am, I guess. And there was a mass evacuation from people in an area called Malakuta, which is a beautiful bushed area, just absolutely stunning on the beach. Randy, you would love to go down there so you could do some surfing. And it was really scary because the fires were enormous and very fast moving, and people had to get evacuated by boat. One of my very close colleagues was there at the time, and she's a climate scientist, and she wrote a really powerful piece which ended up in one of our main newspapers, basically saying this is climate change, we are seeing it. And for her, as a climate scientist, experiencing the fire in her family holiday home and the photos, it was very full on.
Wow.
Randy, you need to turn off your email so we don't keep getting pings from your email for all the podcast listeners who are saying this is really annoying.
What email is? Oh God, how weird. Hopefully that closes it. Sorry about that. Yikes. Okay, is that good now? It should be.
Should be. Just thinking all the podcast listeners are like, I don't want to know how often you get an email, Randy. This is boring.
How unprofessional. I'm so sorry. That was stupid. Never again on that. I think I closed that out. And did you ever see that article in the New Yorker maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago that was about the fires around Melbourne that were so bad that you had that? What was the year that a lot of people died and it was horrific?
Oh gosh, I should know that, but I can't remember. I'd have
maybe
to
around 2008 or something like that. There was a huge,
let me
really
check.
In-depth kind of typical New Yorker article that really got deep into the issue, and it talked about the difference in strategies between California and Australia. I think I'm going to dig that article up and reread it in preparation for what we're going to do next week. But it will be an interesting discussion. We're going to talk in the next couple of days in preparation for it and figure out exactly what we'll be going through with. I guarantee it'll be massively ABT structured, whatever it is that we do. So there you go.
I better teach Ewan about the ABT before then.
Exactly. Forewarning, you're going to get a lot of ABT. Speaking of which,
2009. Sorry, Randy, 2009.
That's when the bad
worst
stuff
day.
Was. Yeah.
The day when a lot of people were very sadly killed in the fire was 7th of February 2009.
And as I recall that New Yorker article, what it talked about was that the prevailing strategy there had been to stand and stay and fight rather than evacuate, and that California just developed this policy of evacuation. And I got to know lots about it 2 years ago when my house burned down.
Yeah,
so, I know. The topic is close to home for me. In fact, everybody around this region here is very nervous about the upcoming fire season. So we'll talk about that as well. Now, here's the next little topic for us to talk about, which is June 9th. We are going to rerun the Narrative Blitz, and we'll be sending out, actually we'll do a big push on that about a week and a half from now. But our Narrative Blitz event that we ran on April 14th was hugely popular. We had 1,500 folks registered for it. And after 2 hours of all these talks, 80% were still there. It was 20 talks, 4 minutes each, that were all incredibly ABT structured, recorded, that I worked with each of the 20 speakers. They were all mostly people from the course. It was almost some ways like an open house for the course, a lot of the stuff that we've learned in the past year. And everybody enjoyed it so much that we decided, let's do it again, Redux. So we're just going to do the same event. We'll have the speakers again join us for Q&As after each of the half-hour sessions. The way it worked is 4 sessions that had kind of 18 minutes of the talks and then 12 minutes of Q&A, and then on to the next section. And the whole thing was ABT structured throughout. So if you really want a good dose of what we're talking about here with the ABT framework, that's what the purpose of that event was. And that's the event that kind of has given rise to a lot of these groups signing up for the training for throughout the fall and the rest of the year. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
And really, I think you need to be honest, Randy. It's basically just a cult party, right? It's the ABT cult, coming together to revel in ABT-ness.
Well, now, wait a second. Liz, are you there? Liz, you're being cued for just a moment right now. What do you have to say about this cult issue? That's part of her talk in the Blitz.
Yeah, I think we do kind of have a cult. And I think, what was it, Randy? You're just not the most charismatic cult leader. You don't have any money for us, but at least you don't do that much murdering.
That's right. Yeah. We're a
could
cult.
Be worse. Could be better. Could be worse.
We're a cult without the charisma, without the money, without the murdering. But other than that, we're all kind of believers of the ABT paradigm.
You just gave away my one joke from the Narrative Blitz. Way to go.
Well, no, that's a teaser. Wow.
Okay.
Joke that's that good. Wow, I can't wait to see the rest of the talk.
All right, I'll go back on mute.
Okay, sorry, they get to hear your sad Keanu story, so that alone makes it worth attending. All right, so that's the Narrative Blitz. All right, now we're going to start to get into the news of the day here, and we're going to do a little sequence here. I'm going to call Fun with Richard Dawkins, and Jen, you're welcome to listen and jump in and challenge me along the way, but. This just came up.
I was about to say, isn't that an oxymoron, Randy? Fun with Dawkins.
Well, I'll get into that. So this cropped up in the news in the last few days. I think maybe a week or two ago. He had his award taken away from him. The American Humanist Association criticized him and took away his award for Humanitarian of the Year, I think, from 1996, Humanist of the Year title. This was for comments that he made on Twitter that were controversial. I don't even want to go into his comments. I'm not interested in that part of it. And in some ways, it's kind of unfortunate because I think he really did deserve that award. He did some amazing things, especially for atheists. And I think his book on atheism was really powerful and important. So, I got plenty of critical things to say about the guy. In fact, we're going to get into some of these critical things I have to say about him. So here we go. This was
what a surprise. What Randy a surprise. Being critical of somebody.
Well, like I said, this is Fun with Richard Dawkins. So hopefully somebody will find this to be fun. So about 2009, the folks at Cambridge University put together a big event celebrating the 200th birthday of Charles Darwin. And my movie Flock of Dodos had come out in 2006 about the controversy over the teaching of evolution versus intelligent design. So they invited me to come show the movie and hold an event there. And it was all wonderful. And the movie had done well. It had been on Showtime for 2 years and it was on Netflix for 5 years and streaming and premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. So we reached a nice big audience with it. And it's a fun, entertaining film that looked at the controversy. In the year or two after it came out, 2006, there were a bunch of group emails that I was on, that Richard Dawkins was on, and others. And there was at one point where I traded emails with him on a side note. We had a really interesting conversation. He sent me some interesting clips, and I thought we had a great little friendship going there. So in preparation for going over to Cambridge University for this event, I sent him a friendly email and said, hey, here's an idea. When we show the movie, what if you join me on stage and we have a little conversation about communicating, popularizing evolution through films versus books. You've written all these books and I've made this film, and we could talk about, compare and contrast the two modes of communication. What came back was the most amazingly arrogant, condescending, abrasive, dismissive email imaginable. I wish I still had it. It was on one of the computers that burned up in my house. But the day that I got it in 2009, I read it aloud in my office to the 5 or 6 people working with me, and they were rolling on the floor. What he said in this email, for starters, was I had very humbly said to him, I made this movie, Flock of Dodos. I don't know if you know much about it. It was mentioned in these group discussions. He said, yes, I saw your movie. I was with a group of scientists. We did a screening of your movie. I found that you were, what did he say? Positively sycophantic towards the creationists in your film, and found the whole thing very off-putting. Went on, chewed it up, spat it out. I had mentioned in there that I had a book coming out, Don't Be Such a Scientist, in 2009 that was about science communication. And he said, no, I do not want to share a stage with you to talk about how to communicate evolution. And furthermore, good luck to you with your book. I hope it gets translated into 14 different languages and sells 1.8 million copies, or some really specific numbers like that. And as I read it aloud, I thought, why so specific? And then one of my guys was there on the computer and he was searching and he said, oh, that's his book, the God Delusion. It's been translated 14 languages. So he's taunting you, saying, I hope your book competes with my book. It was just so unbelievably off-putting. And so that then leads to the next step, which is that just a few months later, when my book came out, the good people at the New Scientist in the UK contacted me and asked me if I would review his new book called The Greatest Show on Earth. And when this thing cropped up in the news this morning, somebody forwarded me the article about Dawkins. I had completely forgotten I wrote this review. I haven't looked at it since 2009. It came out and it didn't really get any attention. And there was no email address for me with it. So I never heard from anybody. It just went out into the ether. But I called it up this morning and reread it. And actually, this may be obnoxious, but you'll find me laughing at what I wrote, because I knew when I wrote it, I just threw caution to the wind. I didn't care. So here's the title of the review. Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins. Creationists won't be wooed by logic, however eloquent, and they certainly won't be swayed by condescension, says Randy Olson. So let me just read a few little excerpts from this thing here. And let's see, I got to move that dang window there down to there. So, and so the reason, part of the reason to read some of this stuff is that it followed ABT structure, what I presented there. I started the whole thing off perfect ABT. I began with all this positivity. I said, when he has that fire in his belly, Richard Dawkins is arguably the greatest living popularizer of evolution. His foundational work, The Selfish Gene, inspired a generation of evolutionary biology students, myself included, while The God Delusion was a powerfully effective self-esteem booster for atheists in the closet, which is really true. When I read that book, I just, I'm not an atheist, but I really could see how there are so many people that for years, in the United States, it is a Christian nation, or traditionally. And so to be an atheist was really a social dilemma for people. His book helped a lot of people coping with that. With this new book, splendidly titled The Greatest Show on Earth, yada, 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 he makes the case defending evolution. I go on and talk about that. And I mentioned here, two of the greatest efforts in recent years come in both flavors, Atheist, Why Evolution is True by Jerry Coyne, and Believer, Finding Darwin's God by Ken Miller. Both of them wrote great books, and they're great guys, and really good job of defending evolution. These previous books were so well written, it seemed the challenge had been met. Another argument for evolution book could only be justified by a great new angle on how to reach the unconverted masses. Implying that your audience is stupid does not qualify as a great new angle. Yet this is precisely what Dawkins does. He opens the book by mentioning his two previous books about evolution, and with a nearly audible scoff adds that back when he wrote those books, when people apparently were smarter, he didn't have to argue that evolution actually happened. Quote, that didn't seem to be necessary, he says. By the first chapter, he's comparing his predicament to a history professor forced to teach, quote, what does it say? A baying pack of ignoramuses. That's literally what he called creationists. I mean, why would you write with that tone? And dealing with rearguard defense, today he proclaims, quote, all but the woefully uninformed are forced to accept the fact of evolution. I mean, just so dismissive. I went on to say it's really comical if, quote, spot the condescensions is a new drinking game, then bottoms up. There's one in just about every chapter. Though Dawkins says from the outset, quote, this is not an anti-religious book. He can't help but knock religion throughout. I mean, that was the absurdity. He says at the beginning, this is not an anti-religious book. And then the whole thing is ridiculing religious people. For instance, he writes, quote, God, to repeat this point, which ought to be obvious, but isn't, never made a tiny wing in his eternal life. Young earth creationists are, he writes, quote, deluded to the point of perversity. You get the sense that Dawkins just can't control it, as if he's on this. This is the line that they see. The editors, I think, didn't like him. And that was part of why I think they chose me to write this thing. And they were thrilled with what I wrote. And they did two things. So they picked this one line. This was their pull quote they put out in bold. It said, you get the sense that Dawkins can't control it. It's as if he suffers from anti-religious Tourette's. And then, I go on to talk about how much he just kept throwing crap. I love this last little part here. But in the end, you have to wonder why Dawkins wastes so much time trying to argue with creationists. We all know that creationists are not rational thinkers. They're driven by beliefs, not by logic. Dawkins provides a transcript of his interview with the president of Concerned Women for America, which reads like a Monty Python skit, as the woman, a bullheaded creationist, simply answers all of Dawkins' sophisticated argumentation by saying she's not convinced. Like a cartoon character standing in front of a hail of bullets taunting, quote, you miss me. It's a shame that Dawkins couldn't take a few tips from his atheist colleague, Jerry Coyne. Coyne's powerful and popular book was, to quote Booklist, quote, far more presentational than disputatious. That's a desperately needed attribute these days in making the convincing and persuasive case for evolution. And that's a great quote there from Booklist, far more presentational than disputatious, because what that's talking about is the age-old rule in communication of don't tell us, show us. Present to us all this evidence that will make us make up our own mind. Don't just sit there and hurl insults at religious folks just for, I don't know, it just didn't make the case. Okay, so then that's the review that I wrote. Now, the craziest part of what they did with my review that I didn't know they were going to do this, and again, I think they really had it out for him, was right around that time, he got caught up in one of many controversies where he's misspoken. Sometimes he just doesn't know what he's saying to the public. And he ended up doing multiple interviews where he defended, quote, mild pedophilia. And here's an article from The Atlantic. The title of it is Richard Dawkins defends, quote, mild pedophilia again and again. Richard Dawkins defended mild pedophilia in an interview this weekend. It's not the first time. And here's a quote from it. It says, referring to his early days at a boarding school in Salisbury, he recalled how one of the unnamed masters, quote, pulled me on his knee and put his hand inside my shorts. He said other children in his school peer group had been molested by the same teacher, but concluded, quote, I don't think he did any of us lasting harm. Yeah, I see you shaking your head. I mean, can you believe
who says that? I'm really sorry that he experienced that. I think that's really awful. But who defends that? I mean, that is just beyond, it's just beyond unbelievable. And how completely disrespectful is that for people who have experienced awful things in their childhoods. I mean, I'm kind of speechless.
It really is.
How's that budding friendship of yours going, Randy?
I think it might be in the waste bin. But here's the punchline to the whole thing. So, when you publish a book review like I wrote there, and you want to put a picture of the author in there, all you got to do is go online and you find, routine standard headshots of the author that aren't suggestive at all. You'd have to look pretty long and hard to find a picture that makes the author look like a pedophiliac sitting on a park bench looking for children. But look at the photo that they published with it. The picture there on the left. And when it came out, I looked at it like, what a creepy looking photo. I'm sorry for people who are just listening to the audio, but it is a picture of Richard Dawkins sitting on a white park bench, looking over his shoulder like he's scanning for who knows what. And, there's the other article there with your normal.
It's a weird photo. The photographer needs to learn a bit more about natural settings and body expressions.
Well, I think to the contrary, I think that the editors somehow came across this photo and said, hey, let's put this with his article just to make him look even worse. And then the last thing to say is that I did do the event at Cambridge University. It was a ton of fun. We showed Flock of Dodos. They were wonderful and hosted me there for 2 or 3 days. We did a bunch of different activities. And one night they had this kind of academic stately dinner in a conference room with about 25 of these professors. And it was really amazing. They're there were major ecologists whose name I knew from my career as a scientist, who never would have given me the time of day as a scientist, but as a filmmaker, they were all really nice to me in the film dodos. And so there were like 20 people around this long table in this sort of stately conference room. And then they start, after dinner was served, then they started this kind of whole table discussion where people would take turns, and they're all, you know, very polite British folks. And then somehow they got off on Dawkins, and I couldn't believe it. All of a sudden, all this bile came pouring out. God, on the number of people that did not like him. And I just sat there kind of quiet, like, whoa, he's got a lot of enemies out there. So, yeah.
Randy, sorry to interrupt, but was that because of personal interactions, that they had personal kind of vendettas against him? Or was that because of the kind of image he was portraying of, you know, of evolutionary biologists in the UK? Or was that his, you know, I mean, what was it that they hated so much?
It really seemed like a whole spectrum of, he seemed like an outlier within whatever department he was associated with, and just didn't have a lot of close supporters. And I think he got in lots of political battles with people, and you can see, you know, he's just a very contentious person, this whole persona. That's part of why he's got such a big audience. You know, he's out there arguing things, and he's got a very distinctive voice, and he's got pretty strong narrative intuition. So he's a great writer, all those kinds of things. And I mean, one of the things is, like, Bill Maher's had him on his show on HBO many times. And it's great to be polarizing like that, but then don't complain about, oh, the world's so polarized nowadays. And don't write a book where you say, you know, you have nothing against religious people, and then just fill the book full of anti-religious statements, ridiculing them, calling them a pack of baying ignoramuses. That's not real persuasive. So that's the way it goes on the Richard Dawkins story.
Interesting.
Yeah. Have you come across him and stuff over the years?
Oh, I mean, I've, you know, as a good evolutionary biology student, undergrad student, I certainly read books. I mean, Selfish Gene was a really important read back in my early undergrad days, no question. And I think he's a very skilled writer. As you say, you know, he's eloquent. He has a beautiful way of writing. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just absolutely flummoxed by him defending what happened to himself as a child. I just cannot fathom anyone with a platform like he has saying something like that is just so deeply destructive. I'm appalled. I didn't know that until you just showed me that.
Yeah, I think that media power brings bad things out of lots and lots of people. And his counterpart that I spent years worshiping when I was a graduate student was Stephen Jay Gould. And when I showed up for graduate school, I was just an absolute fan of Gould, and was lucky enough to end up making friends with a couple of his graduate students, and ending up spending Tuesdays and his Tuesday lunch discussion group. And he was tremendous back in those early years when I first was a graduate student. Once he became famous, he changed. And sadly, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he was on the cover of Newsweek. And then suddenly everybody was there pounding on his door. He was never again the great guy. He was a great, great guy. When I started graduate school in 1978, he was one of the guys, and he loved baseball and played in poker games that we played in at people's houses and things like that. It was just really fun and easy to get along. And I absolutely loved his writings, his columns, in the Natural History magazine. It was really a shame to me years later when I was teaching at USC, and I taught the intro bio course at one point and tried to get in some of the labs assigning the students to read some of his essays. And the students hated his writing. They felt his writing.
Really?
Yes, they felt it was arrogant and used too many big words and just had this tone. And I just sat there. How can you say that? I love these essays. His essays are so important. And I wished. Well, anyway, that's all another topic we'll get into at some point. But let's.
It's a style, right? That was his style.
Yeah, he was so well versed in the humanities and arts and literature and things like that I really have not seen. I've never seen anybody who could write as broadly as he did and reach across the disciplines the way he did. I think some of the people in those disciplines were offended and felt that he wasn't as knowledgeable in their discipline as he made out to be. But for me, he just really had a gift for reaching into the humanities and pulling parallels to help illustrate evolution through all kinds of cultural evolution we see in our society, which was tremendous. But in terms of advancing our narrative here, so that's as much as we need to say about Dawkins. But here's the next little thing, and this is pure ABT stuff, and I'll be interested to hear your take on this. This is the idea of the Dobzhansky template, which is one of the fundamental tools that we've developed in the ABT framework. Not sure that we worked on it much with your group a year ago in the course. Did it come up much?
No.
You know what it is, don't you? The simple one sentence
Yeah.
template. So it's modification of the famous article from Dobzhansky, and the template is basically nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. It's a simple tool that I tossed out way back in the connection book in 2013 and just sort of, let's see if this is of any value. And then as we began running our story circles narrative training, for which we ran, about 100 circles total, and I began interviewing people and asking them, how did it go? What did you find most valuable? And over again, people would say, the ABT template is really powerful, but the tool that over and over again was really had these explosive moments was the Dobzhansky, where we'd be working on somebody's narrative and you'd run through that exercise, nothing in blank, so nothing in caribou management makes sense except in the light of, reproductive cycles or who knows, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But it's that one thing that explains everything possibly. And sometimes there is one thing, sometimes there isn't. But sometimes there is. Sometimes there's one. It's kind of like multivariate analysis. Sometimes there's one factor that really accounts for a whole bunch of different things. It's kind of like systemic diseases. You get these diseases where there's one gene that manifests itself in multiple symptoms throughout the body. And the person can be suffering from this syndrome and having all these symptoms, can't make any sense of it. And finally, the geneticist comes along and says, wait a second, I think you've got this one gene that's out of whack. And so it's finding that one thing that explains everything. Nothing in blank makes sense except in light of blank. And it's a template to help you find what's at the core of the most important effective writing, which is theme and creative writing. They always tell you your writing really won't ever resonate deeply unless you're working on some central theme that and you're really trying to develop. And so this is a case here of two different stories related to the New Yorker, in which what I'm suggesting, I'm sure no one will ever do this, but these are just the thoughts that hit me, which is the New Yorker is really, like a lot of great magazines, really good at fact checking. And I've been interviewed over the years, probably 4 or 5 times for New Yorker articles. And whenever it comes out, the fact checking department contacts you and runs by the things that you're being quoted on and wanting to make sure that, if you said 23 acres, that is exactly what they've got, and not 28 or who knows what. And all of that's really good and important at the fine scale of getting your facts exactly right. You want the article to be accurate. But what if your article has got all the information correct, but tells the wrong story? What if the overarching message of the article is that this is the most important thing in caribou management, for example, and you're telling the story that, for example, what if you wrote a story about immigration on the California-Mexico border, and you tell the story that, there's this one used car dealership near the border, and nothing in all of the immigration dynamics for the whole border between California and Mexico makes sense except in the light of this one used car dealership that has this enormous impact, as a hub for all this sort of activity. What a great story. If that were true, like, wow, I would love to read a feature article about that. Really? All the immigration dynamics, they're all come back to this one place and all the things. And you get that sometimes in stories. But what if it's wrong? What if you're telling the wrong story? What if you go and interview 10 experts on the border about immigration, and every one of them says, what are you talking about? That's a great story, but that's not really true. That thing is trivial, whatever. And so that's the idea of what I call Dobzhansky checking. What if you had these 10 experts fill out the Dobzhansky? Nothing in immigration on this California and Mexico border makes sense except in the light of what would they point to? And if all 10 of them say, oh, this one used car place, and then, you got a great story. But if not a one of them says that, then you ought to start wondering about it. So that's kind of the thinking behind these two stories that I'm going to go through right now that are related to the New Yorker. One of them is an environmental issue. One of them is a true crime issue. Which would you like to hear about first, Jen?
Well, as someone with an environmental background, I'm going to totally say true crime, of course.
There you go. Or in the case of South Park, informative murder porn. They did a whole episode on that. Everybody's obsessed with their favorite true crime series, whether it's on TV or podcasts. So that's exactly what this is about, this first one. And for 15 years, I have lived in the humble little seaside community of Malibu, California. I moved out here because I surf so much, and it's an interesting community. I've gotten to know lots of people here, and about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a very unfortunate incident that took place. It wasn't even really in Malibu. It was in Calabasas, next town over, but nobody knows about Calabasas. Doesn't make for a good story. So the story had to be set in Malibu. And it was a tragic story of a father and 2 daughters that were very young, like ages 2 and 4, I think, that was out camping at the state campground. And a guy came up and with a gun and shot him, and just right there in front of the 2 kids, and killed him. It was horrifying, horrified the community. And in the months before then, there'd been some incidences of people hearing gunfire in that region around there. But, that happens in lots of places. It wasn't a huge story. It was kind of quirky and weird, but it was horrifying when this murder happened. And then everybody, went crazy over it to some extent, but it was still way over there. It didn't have any impact in the local community. I was here. I lived through it. And yet a reporter from the New Yorker has now made this podcast called Lost Hills. It's 7 episodes at least. And I've listened to a few of them. And if you live here and you look at this thing and you just, who's telling this story? Where's this coming from? It begins by, if you look at it, just search Lost Hills right now on your podcast platform, iTunes or whatever. You'll see the description refers to it as the close-knit seaside community of Malibu. If ever there was the definition of the opposite of close-knit, it is Malibu, California. There is not one close-knit thing about this community. I've lived here 15 years. It's 13,000 people, and it's mostly billionaires and blue-collar workers. Lots of construction guys that I surf with out there, and then lots of billionaires and celebrities that this is one of 4 or 5 homes. You never see them around. They, occasionally show up. I lived in a house for 12 years that was 2 homes over from Anthony Hopkins. My place was a, cheapo little seaside cottage. He had just this kind of summer home there. In all those years, sitting on my balcony with my binoculars looking over there, I never saw him on his porch. I never met the guy. Once I bumped into him at our polling place one morning, but other than that, you just don't see the people very much at all. It's not close knit. And you go to the city hall events. I organized a bunch of events. I did a whole panel on climate change, and no celebrities showed up at that. They don't mix with the average folks. So it has nothing to do with close knit. And yet that doesn't make for a very good story. I mean, what are you going to say in the anti-close knit seaside community, or the community that's overrun by tourists all summer long, hundreds of thousands of tourists out here, the seaside community that's bisected by the Pacific Coast Highway. So the whole thing is just built around a highway. But none of that makes for a good story. And so then when you live here and you listen to this thing like, what world is this from? It doesn't bear any reality. Then I know a bunch of the characters that are in there, and I've got all kinds of weird things to say about those people, but how in the world did you pick them? And do you know really who they are and what? Oh God, it goes on and on and on.
So Randy, I haven't listened to any of it. I've just seen the blurb, and I can see that their whole catchphrase is around it being a close-knit community. But how much of the actual podcast is based on this premise of this awful event disrupted the fabric of the close-knit community? Like, how much do they rely on that for the actual theme through the 7 episodes or whatever you said?
A lot. They paint a picture that way, as though everybody was unnerved. But, I was just talking to one of my close friends here, who's a former mayor. They have 5 city council members who rotate through being the mayor. And I'm really close friends with one who was for 8 years a city council member. And so, I got all the scoop from the inside. And she was saying the same thing with me. What in the world? How do you tell these stories? It's not a close-knit community. Didn't even happen in Malibu, happened in Calabasas, on and on. And it didn't terrify the community. It was the kind of thing that everybody occasionally mentioned. Yeah, whatever happened with that. What's really sad and terrible is that there's lengthy interviews. I'm only halfway through it. I don't know that I can make it all the way through, but lengthy interviews with the widow. And it's exploitative. I will just say that, talk about an informative murder porn. It's let's dive into this pain and suffering. That's horrible what happened to her. And I don't know. What can you say? Informative murder porn. South Park nails these things over and over again. And to see it from the inside, it's just a whole bunch of voyeurism. Everybody, just wallowing in
well,
it.
That's what Schadenfreude is, right?
Yeah,
Schadenfreude is,
yes.
taking
Precisely.
pleasure in other people's misery, and it's all over. It's everywhere.
Is it as big in your country as it is here? Informative murder porn?
Look, there's plenty of true crime series that people are into. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really hard to generalize about a whole country and how much we revel in other people's misfortune. I mean, Australians are all about being the Aussie battler, that we have to tough things out. So we like to think of ourselves as battlers. That you've lived here, what the culture's like.
Well, we could go on at great length about the what was it, Lindy Chamberlain story, the dingo ate my baby. I was there for that. I was there when it happened, and I sat there and listened to the ABC morning after morning after morning. I mean, one of the problems that I always felt in Australia, at least in the 80s, was big country, not enough news to fill the media. And what you got in Australia was one story that just didn't get kicked out of the news cycle. It just stayed and stayed and stayed. In the US, it's so many people and so much stuff. Stories come and go instantly. And I don't know that that's a very good thing. But when I was a postdoc at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, we all had those government commuter cars that we'd all ride in the morning. And so you listen to the ABC News every morning, and then just one story like that, it's the latest update and there's nothing new on it. And the Lindy Chamberlain thing just stayed and stayed and stayed. And you're right, there was similar dynamics with something like that. But anyhow, to get back to this informative murder porn, the key point here is about this idea of, I look to the New Yorker as one of the great institutions of journalism in this country. And one of the things to relate this to the ABT framework is that what we're busy doing with this ABT framework is studying this ABT framework, which is the way the brains are for the masses are kind of programmed to want these relatively simple structured stories that have got all this kind of stuff. And it makes it really hard to communicate and material, just, the real world, that it really doesn't have all those twists and turns. The great thing about the New Yorker is they do these feature articles that are 8,000 and 10,000 words. And the writers, so many of them are so wonderful. And Jane Mayer and Jill Lepore and John Seabrook and on, just tons of really great writers that are given the ability to go ahead and tell this whole thing, the real world picture of it, and don't have to worry about shape this thing into a tight little package so that you hold the interest of the short attention span crowd the way they do in the broad magazines. But every time that they go and do something like this, I find it disappointing, which is, this isn't the right story. And that is not a tight-knit seaside community, for starters, which then leads to the other one, which is the environmental issue. And this is a bigger thing that we're not going to have enough time to go through in painful detail, but it's the issue of plastics in the ocean. And I've watched that issue for 20 years, since back when 2004, I put together an event called the Hollywood Ocean Night in Hollywood. And there was a guy wandering around that night at that event covered with plastic trash in his little captain's outfit named Charlie Moore. An awesome guy. He was the real pioneer for the whole issue of plastics in the ocean. And in the spring of 2004 at our event, nobody was interested in plastics in the ocean. And everybody thought he was a homeless dude. What are you doing here? And he was trying to explain to everybody, this is a really serious issue. He'd been out there and seen it in the North Pacific Gyre. Within about 2 or 3 years, he was featured in Rolling Stone, a great little profile there. And that was the beginning. It just exploded overnight. And now there's this documentary, Seaspiracy, on Netflix. That's a whole, we could fill a couple of hours talking about that in the long-term perspective. But Seaspiracy has kind of thrown the plastics issue under the bus in trying to make the case of conspiracy stuff. And they did some kind of cheesy things with that. I don't want to delve into that issue right now. But to get back to the New Yorker, 2 years ago, they did this big feature article. And it was about the kid who went to the North Pacific with his device to try and sweep up all the plastic with this boom stuff. And the whole thing was so ill-conceived. And anybody working on the serious issue knew that this is not where the problem is. The problem is in the coastal environments. It's the plastic trash coming off the land and out in the open ocean. First off, there's not that much, and it's not at the surface. It's all up and down the water column. It's very small. The whole thing was absolutely unrealistic. And lots of people tried to speak out about that, but made for a great story. You know, kid, David versus Goliath, the kid takes on the whole establishment. They said he couldn't do it. He's going to go out there and show them. And so all these pages that could have been used to delve into an and story, the way the New Yorker does have the ability to do, and really do some civic good by communicating to everybody the core problem. And two of my close friends, Marcus Erickson and Anna Cummins, who do work very deeply in this issue, and we've been buddies for 20 years, and I've helped them with communication stuff. Marcus refers to things like this as a distraction. That's a great word. You know, we're on this narrative journey here. Narrative we define as the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. We picked out our problem we're working on, and we're on this journey, and there are these distractions. And that's what went on with that thing. And that kid went out there, it didn't work, ate up a whole lot of media time. I mean, did it bring attention to the issue? Maybe, but, you know, kind of misguided attention. Everybody will debate back and forth. Well, at least he's calling attention to the issue. Yeah, but at the expense sometimes of the real issue is what the two of them told me, which was they went and met with some of the top people in the plastics industry who said, we're laughing at you environmentalists. You can have your plastic straws, you can have your plastic bags. That stuff is so trivial. What our mission is to double the production of plastics in the next 10 years in the United States. And so there's this gargantuan problem. And then here's the media going off chasing after this little, you know, entertainment show out in the oceans. And that gets back to this idea of the Dobzhansky. Had the reporter there called 10 experts and asked them to fill out the Dobzhansky. Nothing in the plastics in the issue, and plastics in the ocean issue makes sense, except in light of nobody would have mentioned going out and trying to sweep plastic off the surface of the ocean. They would have talked about the nearshore issues of the tap, basically trying to turn off the tap. And so that's my overall point about this Dobzhansky as a tool that really, it ought to be a part of journalistic ethics. You know, fact checking is great. Just do it at 2 scales. Don't just check the numbers. Yeah. How many square acres, but also, is there some way you can check that you're really telling the right story and not eating up a lot of media time on something that, we told a great story. It's really fun. Just like informative murder porn pulls an audience in, but are you really helping with the issue? And I just wonder if they think about that.
So Randy, what do you say then to the journalist who says, well, clearly plastic pollution is a really big deal. We need more people thinking about it. A hell of a lot of people read the New Yorker. I can't get an article in the New Yorker that just talks about all the standard stuff of how bad this is, what we're going to do about it. I need a new angle. I need a new hook. This kid is my new angle. So are you really telling me you don't want plastic pollution to feature in the New Yorker? What do you say to that journalist who just says, I can't get it in there without this new snazzy angle that, maybe it's a distraction. Do you just say, okay, let's not bother then?
I can, that's a great question. I'll tell you exactly, which is take a step backwards to the fate of the oceans and do the Dobzhansky for the fate of the oceans. Nothing in the fate of the oceans makes sense except in the light of what? Not plastics, overfishing. That is the core narrative of this movie, Seaspiracy, that's come out. And I hate to say it, but Seaspiracy kind of got the narrative right. I wish that somehow I could have talked to them, not to be interviewed for it, but to give them some advice early on, because when I started my Shifting Baselines campaign in 2002, I spent a lot of time calling all around the conservation groups, ocean groups, and finding out what was going on. And one of the most interesting things I was told was about a big study that was done, I think, at the New York Aquarium, surveying American attitudes towards the oceans. And very simple finding this guy told me they'd found, which was that 80% of people are upset about pollution in the oceans and are ready to do something about it. Less than 20% care about overfishing. So there's your fundamental conundrum. Yeah, really, really interesting. And then we saw it played out over the next decade as we did our Shifting Baseline stuff, trying to call attention to overfishing. And you begin to realize there's a visceral component to pollution, which is people can see it. You can see dead animals. You can understand it. I don't want to be poisoned myself. That motivates me to do something. Overfishing has got a more cerebral element, which is you've got to put together the idea that these fish in your store came from out there and that they were depleting the ocean and that we're ending up with an ocean that doesn't look like it used to, but we don't even have pictures of how it used to. It's all very, very cerebral. And as a result, it's much more difficult to communicate. And that, I think, is the premise of the Seaspiracy movie, which is, look what happened. You know, these big groups didn't go after the tougher challenge of communicating that overfishing thing that's really, really difficult. They went after the low-hanging fruit of, you know, turtles with straws in their nose or whatever. That's one of the issues they raised in that thing. So,
well, because it's the whole, it's far more inconvenient, right? We all want to eat our fish and deal with all the industries that rely on fish meal. And so it's very hard to to eat our fish without having a fishery industry, whereas we can convince ourselves that we can use plastic and somehow just ensure that it doesn't end up in the ocean. It's a very different argument in terms of behavioral change that's required.
Very true. And one of my friends, before I even saw Seaspiracy, one of my friends who's a major person in the overfishing issue, published very important papers, asked me if I'd seen the movie. I said, no, what's it about? And she said, it's about the fact that 20 years later, nothing's changed. All these fish are still being overfished. They're still being sold at your local stores. The prices have gone up, but there hasn't been addressing these issues the way that people had hoped it would be addressed 20 years ago. So it's very deep in that regard. It's a shame what they did with the plastics folks. It was a little bit of a dirty trick in that front, but the bigger narrative there is about the overfishing thing that is just really hard to communicate. And then speaking of communicating, we had one more item on the agenda for today, which I don't know that we're going to get around. We're going to just give it very superficial treatment because I don't want to insult people or whatever. But the last item on the agenda was this paper that I tweeted about that I thought it was from The Onion, but actually not from The Onion.
Sadly not.
Sadly, no, exactly. It came out a few months ago in an academic journal called Science Communication. And why don't you tell me what you think the study had to say?
Well, I think the premise of the study was fine, Randy. The premise was that people are becoming more and more aware of how important effective science communication is. As a result, there's been this huge proliferation of science communication training programs, but we need to have rigorous assessment to work out if they're actually effective or not. If you put students through a SciComm training program like the one I run, do they actually come out as better communicators at the end? So the idea was that they had, I must say, a very, 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 very small sample size of students. We're talking a handful of students, but over a few years. So, eventually it got to more than 2 handfuls. But they did this very intensive training course. And they had, interestingly, the idea was they wanted to see did these students become better at public speaking. And it was all very odd. They were given a particular topic they had to talk about. They had to present it in a very particular way. And even though the question was, do they become better public speakers for a general audience, the audience that was testing them were actually undergraduate students, which is a very different audience. But essentially they just said to these undergraduate students, can you assess how good they are at public speaking before they do the course, and can you assess them again after the course, give them a score, and let's compare the scores. And lo and behold, there was absolutely no improvement. And so they've titled their paper basically, saying science communication doesn't ever work, full stop, don't bother. And I think Randy, you and I would have something to say about that.
No, hang on. I'll push back a tiny bit on that. They had a little bit of qualification there that said
they did.
Yeah, suggestion that it's not clear how much it helps, or that it's negligible. They didn't say full stop. It never works.
No, well, they did say that the students who did their training course got better, but they said that the control students who didn't do the training course also got better, which totally makes sense to me because you get big. I've taught public speaking for a long time. You become a better public speaker by practicing. So by doing it a couple of times, of course, you become better. So you're right. I am being a bit facetious, but it was a tiny little thing. Giving a 2-minute talk. It's not science communication training.
Oh my goodness. Back when I was a scientist, we used to talk about papers that, what was the phrase people would say? It's not even wrong. Meaning that it's so far, so ill-conceived, so far off the mark, so misguided. It's not even wrong. It's not even worth trying to assess it. How in the world can you think you can run a little small scale experiment where you put together your own training form and then generalize from that up to, I guess it doesn't work for anybody. What if I did that with piano lessons? What if I took a group of people that I taught them piano? I don't know how to play piano. What if I tried to teach them piano and then tried to see if they got better than a control group? I don't think they didn't get any better. And then am I going to generalize? I guess piano lessons don't work. That's really kind of the core of what this thing was about. And it's just so disconnected with the real world. Come on, people. The bottom line is, does anybody have a training program that's popular and works well enough that other people through word of mouth want to do it? And that's exactly what we've been doing with this ABT framework course. And we've yet to have any journalists write about it. We've not taken out any advertising. The whole thing's run 14 rounds now, just through word of mouth, and is now booked through the end of the year. And there's no need to try and boast about it or anything like that, or even trying to sell it. It's just plain works. And the idea of somebody then coming out with their academic little experiment they did with students to try and suggest you can't train people on science communication. The fact is it's very, very difficult. Narrative intuition, which is the goal of everything that I preach about, is elusive and difficult, but it definitely happens. People that put their minds to it. I can point you to film school classmates of mine who 25 years ago when we started film school could not tell a story to save their souls. Nobody in that class. They were all 21, 22-year-old Ivy League graduates, and I was in the writing class with them. I was 38, and I had to sit there night after night as they would tell these boring, rambling, and then stories. They're horrible. And some of the worst ones are major screenwriters, not major screenwriters, but, fully employed screenwriters in Hollywood. I run into them at cocktail parties 25 years later. I say, what are you up to? And they nowadays, oh, I got a script at Paramount. It's kind of like Die Hard meets, Speed, and it does this, and they bing, 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 bing. They couldn't talk that way 25 years ago. They've shaped their brains over the course of 25 years of being incubated in this intensely narrative world of Hollywood. And if those people can do it, then scientists can do it at least a little bit. And we see it with what we do now with the ABT framework.
I mean, I really do think it's a good premise. Let's be rigorous. Let's collect some evidence to show that improvements happen. But I think, this particular study was very poorly put together, sadly, because I'd like to do similar with my students. And I guess that the evidence I have is their supervisors saying, oh my goodness, the quality of their talk after they've done a semester with you is just so much better than it was before. So I've seen the improvement in thousands of students over a decade now. There's no doubt that improvement happens.
Yeah, but
you just got to think really carefully what you're testing.
I know, but here's the catch. You're a good communicator. Lots of instructors are not. And the single individual that's running the whole thing makes a huge difference. And if people are being led by someone who's a good communicator, they're probably going to get a lot better because they've got, somebody that they're picking up things from. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people that do communication stuff that aren't the best communicators. So yeah.
But if you read this paper, they absolutely take that on board. And I think the paper's a really worthwhile one reading because they do say that. They say maybe it's just because we're no good at what we do. But interestingly, their argument as evidence of why they do believe they're good at what they do is, they basically say, well, this is my job. And this is, I think there's 3 of them involved. But interestingly, most of their accolades are as writers. There's a Pulitzer Prize writer, winner amongst their group. But writing about science and giving a good talk, they're quite different things. And there's no doubt that there's core skills that are common to both of those. But if you're just trying to get a group of students to be able to deliver a really engaging, accurate, effective talk with a narrative, just because you're a great writer doesn't necessarily mean that that's your forte. I think they're different.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And we're almost out of time here. We should wrap this up. But for the final word on what those people really should do, let's have Liz join us. You still there, Liz?
Man, final word. No way.
We have something that's in the Narrative Blitz. She gives one of the 4-minute talks about what we have labeled as the Liz moment. And can you give us a concise version of what the Liz moment refers to?
The concise version. Sure. Okay. So I'll save the nice professionally directed and produced with visuals and Keanu Reeves in it for people to tune in. But going back to 2009, I was already a fan. I had read Don't Be Such a Scientist. I work in marine conservation. I do talks all the time. And I kind of thought I was decent enough at doing a talk, putting a talk together. And around 2013 or so, I had a conference coming up and I needed to put the talk together. And that's around when I read Connection, which was the first introduction of the ABT. And I thought, hey, this is great. This is like you were saying before, it seems like a simple tool that I could try to apply and do a little better than the usual, which would be like phoning it in and putting the slides together in the hotel and the plane on the way, right? That's a lot of us do that, I should say. We shouldn't. But I wanted to give it more thought and apply the ABT. So I thought about the work we were doing and how I'd communicate it. And it occurred to me, it was really about a lot of particular challenges and problems. So I looked at all of those and I figured out what was the setup, problem, solution dynamic for all of those particular things that I'd want to be talking about. And I just created this talk with a series of mini ABTs, and that was the talk. And it worked out really well. And in the narrative blitz, I give you my 3 takeaways. So I suppose you want to hear those, right?
Yes, please.
The top 3. Like the first takeaway was, it made it really easy to remember and rehearse. And a lot of times I wouldn't even rehearse, like that's the secret of a lot of us. We just do the talk and we show up and we wing it. That's not great, but this allowed me to really think about it. What am I trying to convey? I totally flowed because I remembered it. I rehearsed it really well. And the second thing is, when I was giving the talk, the audience was engaged. And as an educator, when they're engaged and when they're not, you just know. And I looked out, they were actually looking at me, they're paying attention, they weren't all texting or doing whatever. So I really felt genuinely that they were paying attention and cared about what I had to say. And then later after the talk, people were coming up to me and I saw some tweets, and they were essentially sharing the same messages that I had conveyed in my talk, and not getting them all, garbled and messed up. That's often what happens too, is you go there thinking you're going to say a certain thing and this is what you want to convey, and something happens and people come away with it with a whole other thing you didn't intend. But in this case, people got it. So it was that message retention. So those 3 things are what I talked about in the narrative blitz, and it really made a difference for me. And that's where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm a convert now. And I emailed you like an idiot with the whole story, this rambling, this is so great, look what it did for me. And of course you responded, as I should have known if I had known you then, right? And now I'm part of the team. You recruited me to help you with the assessment of the story circles. And I showed up in your book as a case study. I don't even know what page it is, but I loved how you called it a footnote. And you signed it and you sent it to me. So this goes back to whatever, 2014. So yeah, that's my story. And now, here I am, part of the ABT.
Actually,
cult.
you want to know one little thing to toss in there on a separate note, but related to that study, was when we started Story Circles, Liz and I, we did 4 prototypes, undergraduate, graduate, postdoc, and research scientists, and had them do the 10 one-hour sessions of Story Circles. And we video recorded all 10 of those sessions. So we ended up with 40 hours worth of material. And then I had Liz transcribe it all. And then we tried to do some metrics on it. We counted the mentions of and, but, and therefore to see if, with time, were they mentioning and, but, and therefore more? And guess what? They did. By the 10th session, they were saying and, but, and therefore more. But of course they were, that's what the whole thing was about. It just was a meaningless metric. And we put it on the website for, a few months. And eventually I looked at that and like, this is garbage. It says nothing. And communication is such a multivariate thing. You can't boil it down into simple little metrics. That's what that paper does. It's got just massive number of statistics. I mean, great. They brought in a team of metrics folks to analyze the hell out of something that's just a bunch of noise. I'm sorry. It's so
well, I just wish they'd asked the students, do you feel more confident and more competent now as a speaker? Because I have no doubt that their course is superb. It sounds fantastic. It's really intensive, great group of students all working in this immersed environment together. I have no doubt that the course is ace, and I have no doubt that the students come out feeling really good about their public speaking skills at the end. And to boil it all down to what do a group of undergrads think about whether you're a good public speaker or not, I think it's a real shame.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
can I add something to that too? Because I am going to add something. So as I'm doing my PhD now, and one of the things, it occurred to me, I reflected back on having attempted to do all that sort of quantification of all those numbers and what a mess it ended up being in the end. And as I was reading that paper, I had the same sort of revelation. This is why we do mixed methods. This is why we use qualitative assessment methods as well. I'm using mixed methods for my dissertation. And it kind of occurred to me, the narrative blitz is essentially like one big qualitative assessment of story circles and ABT framework course and the whole framework. So it's getting to hear all these rich stories of how people put it into use, how it changed. There's the slow burn. There's all these great themes in there that sort of get referenced in the discussion of that paper. But yeah, I think hearing everyone's stories will give you a better overview of what we're talking about.
Well, and the single biggest thing I would say of all, and sorry, this isn't trying to sell it. It's just, we have a model. We have the ABT framework model. There are no other models. And the framework gives you something to hang all these different things on. And the more you work with it, the more you realize that all of these principles of communication are derived downstream from this model. They all fit into it over and over again. And that's all you can say. At that point, you just got to start digging in and read the Narrative Gym book. And some people are open and interested to it, and others aren't. But it's spreading rapidly outside the science world. That's what's a shame, is there's an awful lot of science people resistant to that. But the business world and all these other groups that I'm working with, what can you do? We're at a point now where we don't need to do sales. We're overbooked and people are using it. And it's just fun to share. And that's the purpose of this podcast, is to kind of share in the benefits being reaped from the model. And that's what we'll continue to do. And on that note, we should probably, let's see whether there are any questions. So we'll wrap this thing up. The biggest thing is to just remind everybody, we're going to start announcing this and pushing on it tomorrow or the next day. And then early next week, we'll push it with the National Park Service folks. And I think the Forestry Service folks, they're going to get the announcements out there about next week's episode, which is going to be this fire above and below California and Australia.
Below,
down below, and above up here in the northern hemisphere. And it's going to be really interesting and fascinating. Such an urgent issue. Is there edginess there, feeling like the next fire season, or do they feel like it's behind you a little bit for a while?
Well, we're heading into winter, so there's no kind of immediate concern, but there's definitely a sense that fire seasons are going to get longer and harsher and more scary as our climate continues to change.
Yeah. Interesting. And the last little thing I didn't even get into was the interview last week with James Carville, where he tore up the whole academic world. He talked about the faculty lounge, was quoted by Bill Maher on Friday night in his show. And I had a whole bunch of quotes from there I was going to read, but they're pretty contentious and pretty vicious. So, and he tears into the climate community in a big way. And I did a guest lecture in his course 5 years ago. I'm a huge fan of his, and everything he said, I totally agree with. But we'll end on a happy, peaceful note here without any more controversy for today.
What? You're shying away from controversy?
Listen to you. This is 7 years I've been working with you. 7 years ago, you're like, oh, everything's great. Now I'm hearing this edge, and you're in the thick of your PhD, and you're getting more and more critical.
I don't care about anything anymore.
He's getting critical. Yikes. We'd all better duck and cover. Here it comes.
Yeah.
But that's all great to listen to. So, all right, we're going to get our act together for next week, and that'll be our first big special, and that'll be 90 minutes, and I'm sure it'll be really cool. So got any final words for us, Jen?
I'll see you next week from Down Under to talk about, fires below.
And fires above. Excellent.
That's right.
All right. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good time out there, and tune in next week. We'll send the announcements out.